Hello, my name is Dr. John McDonald, PhD. My presentation is entitled Reflections of an Australian Acupuncturist on 5 Decades of Theory and Practice. There were different phases of transmission of acupuncture teaching in Australia as new information became available from various sources. English influences, French influences, Chinese influences, modern TCM, Chinese influences, classical, historical, and global engagement. My first introduction to acupuncture was in a Tai Chi class, when a friend brought along Felix Mann's book. He had borrowed it from Russell Jewell, a chiropractor, who had just returned from studying acupuncture with English acupuncture teacher J.R. Worsley. Russell Jewell established Australia's first acupuncture college. J.R. Worsley established the College of Chinese Acupuncture in England in 1966. Worsley was an early pioneer of acupuncture in England and placed a strong emphasis on 5-element styles of acupuncture. Russell Jewell made contact with J.D. Van Buren at his college in England and invited him to present seminars at Acupuncture Colleges Australia in Sydney between 1974 and 1976. In 1976, I attended 2 acupuncture conferences in Argentina, where I met Dr. Frederico Spite, president of the Brazilian Acupuncture Society, and the famous French-Vietnamese doctor Nguyen Van Nie. It was at this conference that I also learned of this major work by Dr. Nguyen, Pathogénie et pathologie énergétique en médecine chinoise, traitement par acupuncture et massage, in which he frequently cited this Vietnamese text, Trung Y Hoc. I also found that the Argentine Acupuncture Society was deriving much of their information from both Dr. Nguyen's Pathogénie Pathologie and the 6-volume Traité de médecine chinoise by Dr. Albert Champreau, of which the 6th volume was co-authored by Dr. Nguyen. So when I returned to Australia, we formed a study group to begin translating chapters of these works from French to English. Russell Jewell made an arrangement with Van Buren to supply teaching materials from his college's bachelor course, which would be taught at Acupuncture Colleges Australia. At the end of the course, students sat an external examination set and marked by Van Buren. Among the early teachers in this course were Meta and Jerry Van Putten, Chris van Baden, and myself. When Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Gough Whitlam, normalised relations between Australia and the People's Republic of China, it became possible for Australians to visit China to study. This coincided with the establishment of 3-month courses offered at 4 international acupuncture training centres in China. This was our first introduction to modern traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, with such aspects as pattern differentiation, bianzheng, and acupuncture point functions. Acupuncture texts in English began to appear from China. The outline was essentially a product of the Cultural Revolution, with all TCM theory stripped away. The Essentials was created by a collaboration between the international teaching centres to use as a text for the 3-month courses. Chinese acupuncture in moxibustion was launched in Beijing in 1987 at the inaugural conference of the World Federation of Acupuncture Moxibustion Societies, WFAS. In the early 1980s, acupuncture texts began to appear in English from publishers in USA, England, and Australia. Some were translations, complete or partial, of modern Chinese texts, but most were based on modern Chinese texts. During a visit to China in 1984 to arrange for my students to undertake a hospital internship in Hangzhou, I visited TCM bookshops in Nanjing and Shanghai and came home with several dozen modern Chinese texts. These included 2 texts on Zhangfu pattern differentiation, which I used as a basis, combined with other material in English and French, for a text for my students on Zhangfu syndromes. A much expanded edition was published as a co-authorship with Dr. Joel Penner from California in 1994, and subsequently it has also been published in Portuguese in Brazil. When my students undertook their hospital internships in Hangzhou, they were most fortunate to be tutored by the eminent Professor Lo Baizhang. In 1985, Professor Lo presented a series of workshops and masterclasses in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, which I organised with the sponsorship of the Australian Natural Therapists Association. Steve Clavey, who studied for his master's degree in Hangzhou in Chinese, and who knew Professor Lo well, translated this short autobiography of Professor Lo and published it in the Australian journal, The Lantern. Professor Lo also contributed a chapter to this compendium on his ideas and clinical experiences. Real estate agents tell us that it is all about location, location, location. But for Professor Lo, needling technique, Shofa, was all about location, angle, depth. His needle technique was very skillful and subtle. Here he was demonstrating on my large intestine 11, Chucha, how subtle changes in angle and depth could produce chi sensation radiating to my thumb, index finger, shoulder, or all 3 at once. Professor Lo also explored historically varied locations of points. Interestingly, Lo's favourite location for stomach 36, Susan Li, has recently been confirmed by the work of Pony Chang as the original Lingshu location. Professor Lo also gave me this gift of his calligraphy. It was a 6-verse variant of the 4-command or dominant point song by Zhu Chuan. This began my love and fascination with acupuncture odes and songs. Du fu san li liu, yao bei wei zhong qiu, jing xiang xin lie chui, mian kou he gu shou, swan tung chu a shi, xiong lei ne guan mo. Du fu san li liu, treat abdominally with Su San Li. Yao bei wei zhong qiu, for waist and back wei zhong's on track. Jing xiang xin lie chui, for nape and neck, lie chui is the trick. For variant version, Tao xiang lie chui chui, to nape and head, lie chui is wed. Mian kou, he gu shou, for mouth and face, the gu is ace. Rhymed odes and songs were a popular method for memorizing acupuncture information, and while they began in the Song dynasty, most of the famous odes and songs were written in the Ming dynasty. There were numerous variations in the texts of these poems and several additional verses. For ache and pain, Sure points rain, for ribs and chest, Ne Guan is best. The first of these additional verses were seen in Professor Lo's calligraphy. Also a variant version for heart and chest, Ne Guan is best. For ribs and sides, Zhugo presides. Young Ling Chuan is surely older as a treatment for the shoulder. For coma state, Ren Zhong is great. What are the most important factors influencing the outcomes of acupuncture treatment? I'm sure there are many different opinions on this question. The starting state of the organism has been shown to influence outcomes, but we have no control over that. After encountering Professor Lowe's strong emphasis on needle technique, I have thought a lot about how important it is. I've come to the conclusion that accurate point selection and adequate frequency and duration of treatment dose, are more important than needle technique. And this has caused me to spend a great deal of time and effort exploring point selection. My exploration of point selection began in 1980, and in 2020, during pandemic lockdowns, I completed and published the first 2 volumes of this project. Acupuncture Point Dynamics Volume 1, the 6-foot meridians, and Volume 2, the 6 hand meridians, conception vessel, and governing vessels. My concept was similar to the Delphi research method, where the opinions of experts in the field are collected and collated to identify consensus. For my experts, I chose books in my library at that time to look for consensus across different traditions on acupuncture point indications. Some texts which were not available when I started were added a little later. Some of my source texts identified primary and secondary indications, implying that they were more important than the other indications. Here, the primary indications were marked with dark grey, while the secondary indications were marked with a lighter grey. The indications with the most agreements are listed first, with the descending order showing fewer and fewer authors listing a particular indication. I wanted to explore how modern point functions or actions, which were only systematized with the creation of TCM in the 1950s, related to actual indications, which are what we find in the historical literature. Point functions without associated indications can lead to errors in point selection. For example, it is not sufficient information to know that a point clears damp heat unless we know the clinical context of the indications involved. It is only by linking the point functions to their relevant indications that we can apply point function statements without making clinical errors in point selection. For example, I have seen damp heat jaundice points being recommended in error for damp heat diarrhea in a published text. In fact, there is very little overlap between points which treat damp heat jaundice and those that treat damp heat diarrhea. Spleen 9, Yinling Chuan, is the point which treats the widest range of damp heat conditions. In Volume 3, I've extended the exploration of point indications to include the classical and historical literature, including the acupuncture odes and songs. Much of this material was only available in Chinese, and I would like to acknowledge and thank my friend and colleague Michael Brown for correcting my clumsy translations. In addition to the 4 dominant points song, there were several other sources which recommended distal points for particular body areas. Upper and lower abdomen, stomach 36 or stomach 36 and 44. Below the navel, spleen 4, navel and abdomen, liver 8. Mouth and face, large intestine 4, or large intestine 4 and 11, or bladder 67. Eyes, side of head and cheek, triple energizer 5, gallbladder 41. For the head, or nape and head and neck, lung 7. Nape and chest pain, small intestine 3, lung 7. Neck and scapular region, small intestine 3, bladder 62. Low back, waist and back, bladder 40 or bladder 40 and 60. Ribs and sides, triple energizer 6. Ribs and chest, pericardium 6, chest, pericardium 6. Heart and chest, heart 8. Heart, chest and abdomen, pericardium 6, spleen 4. Throat, chest and diaphragm, lung 7, kidney 6. Shoulder, gallbladder 34. Shoulder and back, triple energizer 3. Stiffness and pain in knees and waist, kidney 8. Knee, axilla and sides, gallbladder 30 and 34. Legs and feet, governor vessel 16. Legs, ribs and sides pain, small intestine 3. Thigh and knee swelling on standing up, liver 3. The 11 points worth 1,000 gold basically reiterates the points from the 4 dominant points song, adding a second point. The other strong consensus is the use of pericardium 6 for chest. In volume 3, I have also compared the classical indications for the 5 shu points given in the Ling Shu and Nanjing with the modern indications compiled in volumes 1 and 2. As an example, for Ying Spring points pericardium 8, Laogung, and liver 2, Qingjian, we do see modern indications still persist for changes of the colour of the complexion, but not for fever. As for the generalisation in modern practice that Ying Spring points clear heat, we find abundant evidence of heat-related modern indications. In addition to comparing general statements about all the point categories with their modern and historical indications, I've also examined a number of important point groupings and some famous odes and songs. There were 4 versions of Marang Yang's 12 Heavenly Star Points song. These 12 points were said to be the 12 most important points and were so effective it was like splashing hot water on snow, making diseases melt before your eyes. Here are all 4 versions of Marang Yang's song, showing the first half of the indications for stomach 36, Susan Li. As you can see, stomach 36 continues to be used in modern indications for distension and pain in the abdomen, for stomach cold, for berygmus, rumbling intestines with indigestion or diarrhea, and swelling and aching of the lower limbs. In addition to a detailed analysis of Marang Yang song, I have tabulated the indications from 5 of the most famous clinical odes and songs into related clinical areas to provide a useful clinical reference. I find it interesting, for example, that in the Ming Dynasty, points for headache were mainly local points on the head with a strong emphasis on the governor vessel, Jumai, but few distal points. I referred earlier to treatment dose. This began with an analysis of allergic rhinitis studies as part of the study design for my PhD research. I noticed that while all studies which had used at least 12 treatments and treated at least twice weekly produced both statistically and clinically significant effects. However, those studies with fewer treatments or less frequent treatments had either mixed or insignificant outcomes. This eventually resulted in a co-authored editorial with Matthew Bauer and Natalie Saunders, raising the question of dose dependence, including also studies on migraine and depression. As I mentioned in the introduction, sources and influences on my theory and practice began with information coming from England, then France, then modern TCM from China, then classical and historical Chinese sources. Today, acupuncture is a global phenomenon, and I have been pleased to be able to work and share with colleagues from all over the world. How does acupuncture work? This is a very big question, but one which has always intrigued me. When I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to conduct some original clinical research, I chose to explore the changes which occur in the immune system of adults with persistent allergic rhinitis in response to acupuncture. This was the first of 2 reviews published by our team as part of my PhD study. The anti-inflammatory effects of acupuncture and their relevance to allergic rhinitis, a narrative review, and proposed model. This was the second review published by team members. Both of these reviews are free, open access. Mediators, receptors, and signaling pathways in the anti-inflammatory and anti-hyperalgesic effects of acupuncture. This publication in Annals of Asthma, Allergy and Immunology detailed the results of our study, which was a 3-armed randomized control study. Real acupuncture plus usual care versus sham acupuncture plus usual care versus usual care alone. Usual care consisted of medication, relief medication as needed. Effect of acupuncture on house dust mite specific IgE, substance P, and symptoms in persistent allergic rhinitis. Main outcomes. Real acupuncture improved signs and symptoms in adults with persistent allergic rhinitis. At 4 weeks follow-up, signs and symptoms in the real acupuncture group were continuing to improve. After real acupuncture, substance P was decreased by 77.8%, 18 to 24 hours after first treatment. After real acupuncture, dust mite specific IgE was slightly decreased. Real acupuncture appears to have downregulated TRPV1, which is responsible for sneezing, nasal and eye itch and runny nose, and the HPA axis responsible for nasal congestion, while sham acupuncture downregulated only the HPA axis, but not TRPV1. Objective measures of nasal airway clearance, peak nasal inspiratory flow, and mean inferior turbinate obstruction did not correlate with subjective measures of nasal congestion, as measured by symptom and quality of life questionnaires. Moving forward, history and research. Evidence-based methods of point selection should be based on comparative analyses of historical and modern literature. Treatment dose should be explored by clinical research studies. Needle technique should be learned from old masters. External validation should be based on rigorous but appropriate clinical research studies. Thank you for listening.